Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now what I've got in front of me here is an orc captain on a warg, and I'll be honest, it was only today that I found out that warg as a word, as a concept, dates back to ancient Norse sagas. I always thought it was something unique to the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings series, so there you go, I was somebody who learned something today. Now this fella here, he is from the upcoming Kickstarter, which actually should be going live today. This is for the Northern Orcs and Coastal Knights from Quartermaster 3D, and you will have seen his work on this channel a few times because I love what Scott does. So I was really pleased when he got in touch and asked if I wanted to have a play with a couple of samples. Short answer, yes, oh goodness, yes, of course. So I'll pop a link to that in the description. If you do find that before it's gone live, wait a couple of hours and then go check it out again because it will be going live August 1st. So all of the paints for this one will be listed in the description, and the warg is the easiest thing in the world to paint, so even if you've got some without riders, this might come in handy for you. Let's get started. Now sometimes you'll find it easier to paint a rider and his mount separately. In this case though, I've glued them all together for a couple of reasons. First off, I don't mind too much if they are primed in the same color, and we're not looking to win any awards with this, so I'm not too fussed if I can't reach right up under his butt, for example. The other reason is that, honestly, if you're anything like me, I tend to get a little bit excited and assemble miniatures all in one go anyway, and it's still eminently possible to paint them like this. So that's what I'm going to do. If you do end up, popping this guy off and painting him separately, you might want to prime him with a grey or something instead, but for what I've got in mind, the Zandri dust that I've used here will work perfectly well. Now we are going to concentrate first of all by painting the mount, and Zandri dust is a little bit lifeless for real, living creatures. So what I'm going to do is start with some XV88, which has a little bit more warmth. It's kind of an orangey color. And the size of the brush here is not going to matter. You're really just splattering this on. Don't worry too much about where it ends up. All you want to do is make sure that the lower half ends up covered in it. Now this will cover very well over Zandri dust, so you'll probably find one coat will do you just fine. And there is one detail on the rider himself where I'm going to paint a little bit of that XV88 onto his belt. I'm just doing that now because, well, it's easy while I've got that paint out. Now once that's dry, you'll have something that looks like this. Now that was one coat for most of that. Just back here on his haunches, I did come back and give it a second to make sure that it was a solid color. What I'm going to use now is Mournfang Brown for the furry bits. Now this is a little more warm than I want the final product to be. But because I'm going to shade this quite heavily later on, a brighter, more rich color now is going to work quite well. You'll see as I come up near the edges of any little fuzzy fluffy bits, I'm going to stop just as I reach those, but otherwise cover over all of the fur, and likewise over our base coats, Mournfang Brown will cover pretty well in one go. Now once that's dried thoroughly, get some of the Mournfang Brown on your palette and water it down until it's really quite similar to a shade. What you want to do then is come along areas where it's going to meet the fur and just dab a little bit on to give yourself a nice soft transition between those two areas. Now this is going to look quite gloopy going on, and if you like you can just sweep it up and away with your brush, but this is a nice and quick way of getting a slightly more natural transition between those two areas. Now a further step to tie those areas of fluff and body together is going to be a dry brush, and that's also going to give us a little bit more texture on these raised areas. So you'll see in particular on the fur very quickly, this works brilliantly. Now what I'm using, this is Tyrant Skull, and I'm using a very large makeup brush. I don't know exactly what type it is, it's just a nice soft one. You can pick these up very cheap on Amazon or what have you. And the reason why I like these is they are so soft. It is very difficult to apply too much. So you see I'm going over the same area a few times to slowly build up that color and that little bit of definition. Now at the moment that's going to look pretty sharp, but don't worry about it because once we shade this is going to bring it all together. As well, you'll see sometimes people talking about wanting to get rid of the slight chalkiness that you can get with dry brushing. Honestly, in this instance, it's ideal. I like that little bit of texture that it adds to our miniature. The figure itself is quite smooth, so anything we can do to accentuate some of the, the real life texture that would be in this fur and fuzz, all the better. What I'll turn to now is Screaming Skull, and I'm just going to quickly blast this across his teeth. I'm not too fussed if I hit his gums. I'm using this instead of something like Ushabti Bone because the Tyrant Skull will look quite similar to Ushabti Bone. So instead I want to go brighter on his teeth, but don't use a white, like a pure white, because it won't look natural. As well, all his little claws, don't forget his wee little peaty peats. Now his eyes I am going to paint off screen, just because it'll be a little bit easier for me to get in there, but I'm going to use Flash Gets Yellow for that. It is going to look awful right now, so trust me, we're going to use the shade later on, like I said, to bring a lot of this together and tone it down. If I make any mistakes on the shape of his eyeball, I can just go back to some XV88 and paint around the eyelid and fix that up. Now I'm going to paint in his tongue, and what I have here, this is Word Bearer's Red. Now there isn't really a correct color for this. I'm using it because it's got a little bit of purplish to it, which is quite nice. It looks a little more natural, I think. But Corn Red will also work very well in this spot. Now if you want to get really saucy, a little bit of Pink Horror along his gums will work super well to bring those out. Now, same as with everything else, you can go back over with your base coats, particularly XV88. If you go a little bit overboard with this. And then pretty much the last of the base coats, barring his little saddle there, I'm going to use Eshin Grey to paint in his nose. Now, this one will look a little bit lighter than it should going on, but as with most paints, it's going to darken down a bit as it dries. If you fancy, you can also paint in a bit of his lip with this. I'm going to have a look at a reference photo before I decide what to do with that, but up to you if you fancy that on your miniatures or not. Now that is most of the base coats down on the Warg, so now I'm going to turn to the Orc. Now the question of what color is Orc skin, even the Lord of the Rings will give you a few answers on that. Personally, I like a grimy, not quite olive kind of green, so what I'm using is Death Guard green. This will cover very well over our Xandri Dust primer. And don't worry too much, like particularly up around his helmet here, just splatter it on, because we are going to paint that helmet in a minute anyway. Now once you've got his skin down, the next layer up is going to be his clothing. Now most of the Orc captains I've seen tend to have a little bit of red on them somewhere. I quite like it as like a mark of rank. It works really well because it also makes these guys stand out quite nicely from the rank and file. So I'm using Corn Red because I don't want a very vibrant red. I want it to be dark and moody, and you'll see it covers beautifully. So paying attention around his trousers, and he's got, if I tip him up here, up under his sleeves, a little bit of ingenuity off camera will let me reach those. Now this next step is where he's going to really start coming together. What I have, this is Black Grey from Vallejo, and it is very similar to Corvus Black, but the coverage on it is much better. So what I'm going to do is paint in anywhere that I want to be an off-black, grimy, leathery sort of color. First of all, because this is darker than Eshin Grey by quite a bit, and on top of that, it will prove a very handy base coat for quite a few of the colors that are going to follow. So the saddle under here, basically, there's going to be quite a bit. So I'll come back and I'll show you what I have painted in Black Grey. Now he starts looking a little bit more familiar, but you can see I've probably overdone it there. The reason being, The armor that I've painted black with along everything else, I am going to paint in a dark gunmetal in a little bit, and it's going to look better if I place that over a darker undercoat. What I am going to do now, though, is to tidy up the little bits of fluff on his shoulders, and for this I'm using Rakarth Flesh. Now this will be nice and quick, and then over the top of this we're going to do another little bit of careful dry brushing. Now we'll start applying. This is Iron Warriors, which is a really dark gunmetal color, and we'll put that over all of his armor. You see we get a little bit of bleed through from the color underneath, so just as well it's nice and dark and sinister. Isn't that a cool gunmetal? Sorry, I'm gushing here. I just really like how Iron Warriors looks, and I usually get so few reasons to put it on a miniature, but it's just, brilliant. Anyhow, we're going to go back now to Mournfang Brown and paint in just a handful of the remaining leather details, particularly bits which are going to have the teeth on them. So these little doublers up around his neck, and these cuffs on his wrists. Anything at this point that is still leather, a little bit of warmth isn't going to go awry. So Mournfang Brown, away we go. And then I'm going to use Morghast Bone to paint in the bone details. Now you could stick here to Screaming Skull, we've already got that, but I want a little bit of difference visually between the live teeth and claws of our warg and the trophies essentially that our boss man is wearing. So that's why I'm using Morghast Bone. It's going to look a little darker and more muted than Screaming Skull would. Remember as well that dental hygiene in Bad Guy Land is never as good as it is anywhere else, so a little bit in the teeth as well will work quite nicely. What I've got now is Leadbelcher, something nice and dark, and I'm going to go ahead and paint his sword here. Now the last thing that I want to do before I shade him is to differentiate between a couple of those remaining areas of black. So I'm going to go back to my Eshin Grey from earlier and just these bits, just change a couple up. So once you're finished with that, it's time to go around and do any last minute cleanup that you need to, and now we're going to shade this bad boy. What I've got is a pot mixed up here of Agrax Earthshade and Lamian Medium. This is half and half. The bigger pots, like the old pots, are pretty handy for the sheer size of them. What I'm going to do is, after having given this a good shake, chuck it over everything. Now we really want to make sure that we're working it into all of the recesses. And as you apply it, if it gets any huge big chunky pools like this on the cape here, move it around a little bit with your brush. So I am going to bucket this dude in Agrax Earthshade, then we'll give him about half an hour to dry and see what we've got at the end there. Now that's not 100% dry yet, but I think we're on to a winner. And what we're going to do is just a couple of highlights to make him stand out a little bit more from the rank and file. There's nothing saying that you couldn't put this on the table, he'll look pretty cool, but it won't take much to really make him pop. So what I have is a little bit more Screaming Skull and a raggedy old brush that I've trimmed down. We're going to use it as a dry brush, just lightly dragging close to the edges of detail on the furry bits. Now that will work across his shoulders too, and then what I'm going to do is go to a nice fine brush and some fresh Screaming Skull, just to add in a couple of highlights to things like teeth and claws. Now the trouble is, it's actually really difficult to keep both the rider and the mount in focus when I'm showing you that, but oh well. Anyhow, what I've got next is Nurgling Green, and I'm going to use this to paint just a couple of details on his skin, so bits like the backs of his knuckles and his chin, just to add a little more depth to those. Now for his clothing, I'm going to use Wazdakka Red. You could use Mephiston Red if you wanted a slightly more vibrant color, but I want to play into that sort of faded, beaten up red. So Wazdakka Red it is. Now when it comes to the black leathery stuff he's wearing, what I'm going to use is Skaven Blight Dinge to highlight this. Now, it is possible to very quickly go overboard with this and basically turn him grey. So I'm going to be careful and mind how much of this I put on. If you want to throw on slightly more, something like Eshin Grey again, go back to that base coat, will work pretty well here. Now we can have some fun. What I've got here is Scrag Brown, and I've watered this down a lot. This is maybe 5 or 6 parts water to 1 part paint, and what I'm going to do is just jam this into the recesses to give us a nice rusted finish to the armor. Now this is going to look pretty intense going on, but as it dries it will tone down quite a bit. Anywhere that you're worried that you've got too much of it on, you can either just slurp it away with your brush, or in some areas even brush it away with your thumb, smear it in. And let's have a bit of fun here and add some of this to his mail. And I'm also going to pop a little bit of it onto his blade, because you can't have evil bad guys without rusty blades. That's just the look. Now you'll see a little bit of rusty discoloration in the recesses there. It's a bit more prominent in reality, and it is one that it is possible to overdo, but be a little more adventurous with it than you might think, because the results will look cool. What I'm going to do now is just a tiny wee bit. This is steel. It is from the Vallejo Model Air range. This is very similar to Stormhost steel, or Stormhost silver rather, but I'm using this just because I like how it comes off the brush. What I'm doing is just a few little nicks and scratches. I don't want to paint actual straight lines as highlights right along an edge. I just want to make things look like they've caught a fresh ding right at the corner. So once I'm finished with this, as I go around and touch up the metal work, so once I'm finished with this, I'm going to go ahead and matte varnish him, and I will use my Instar Varnish Plus, like I always do. I quite like that matte finish. And then go ahead and pop a base on him. And the recipe for that one will be in the description. So let's get a look at this fella once he is all finished. And there at last, our Orc Captain on Warg is complete. And in truest fashion, I think the Warg, which was the easiest and fastest part to paint, is probably the better looking bit. That's always true, I tend to find, with Cavalry stuff. Now you'll see as well that I have dabbed in a little bit of black into the eye when I was finished there, but the dark base I think adds a whole lot to the miniature. Suddenly, without that bright Xandri dust ring around the end, he looks a bit more evil and sinister. It suits me down to the ground. So thank you very much again to Quartermaster 3D for letting me have a play with these. The previews are awesome. I am really looking forward to seeing the rest of the range come out, because they are just brilliant. As always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue and resin, including all of my gorgeous producers who are showing up on screen now. Your support is what keeps this channel ticking, folks. Now, any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.